Mr Hudson.
My lady, the first witness is Joanna Killian.
Just ask you to stand. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming back to help.
Ms Killian, are you the Chief Executive of the Local Government Association?
I am.
And during the pandemic, were you the Chief Executive of Surrey County Council?
I was.
You have provided a witness statement to Module 9 of the inquiry. The reference number is INQ 000655757. Is that right?
It is.
Ms Killian, the first question, in a sentence or two, what was the role of the Local Government Association in the economic response to the pandemic in England?
So the Local Government Association represents more than 300 councils in England, and our role was to coordinate our work with central government to make sure that the voices of local government were material in the government's planning and action in support of the pandemic.
The first set of questions is about local government funding. And the first question within that set is a broad one about the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. The evidence the inquiry has received so far tends to support the broad view that the Ministry engaged well with local government on funding during the pandemic. Do you share that view?
I do. There's been a long history of positive working with the department and local government. That's based on the need every year to have deep discussions about how local government is funded and the mechanisms they have to deliver public service. It's also true that those discussions and consultation arrangements absolutely provided the bedrock to the discussions that were had when the pandemic came into view. So it was a very strong set of relationships that were in place.
So if it worked well during the pandemic, do you think that primarily owes to the pre-existing relationships and structures on those issues?
It was partly a history of positive relationships in the build-up to the pandemic, but it's also true that extra and specific arrangements were put in place. So, for example, the department would regularly reach out, seek the views of the LGA, but individual councils. They made provision for representatives from each of the regions, chief execs, to be connected, engaged and informed on big policy matters as the pandemic grew and through the life of the pandemic. So there were existing relationships, but new provisions that made it much more possible for the voice of local government to influence the design of schemes and programmes that they were thinking through.
More narrowly, on certainty of funding for local government. Presumably it's important for local governments to have certainty on the amount and the timing of funding. Is that right?
It is. And it's true to say that going into the pandemic, we had good relationships with MHC, CLG, but absolutely there was also the context that local government had experienced significant cuts for the previous 10 years. So the financial position of councils was weakened through that. We had become used to annual planning, so the disruption caused initially by the pandemic and particularly the announcements to lockdown were really a sort of shock and a shudder. So for us in local government, it was crucial through the pandemic that where possible, authorities did have certainty. But again, in the context, I think, of none of us understanding early on that the pandemic would last for so long and the implications would run, across 2 financial years.
So is that maybe a reflection that certainty is even more important where finances are already in a somewhat parlous state?
absolutely certainty is key, and one of the sort of core arguments for us has always been that local government should be funded on multi-year settlements. Again, the department has listened to that actually, and we are sort of more confident now that that would be the case. But definitely at the time of the pandemic, while we absolutely welcome tranches of money being made available to us, it was the uncertainty from sort of quarter to quarter what would be made available, and that did affect how we could plan to best effect.
We know as the inquiry we're well versed in the fact that the pandemic was an incredibly uncertain time. Given the inherent uncertainties of the pandemic, what are your reflections on how well the ministry provided certainty of funding to local government with that background in mind?
I think MHCLG already understood the sort of pressures that were sort of built into the system, particularly around adult social care and for children's social care. So I believe that sort of knowledge about our sort of weaknesses and frailties absolutely was material to helping MHCLG both think about their own response to us financially, but also to advocate for us across other departments where relationships were not so strong or understanding of the sector was much weaker.
I'd like to ask you now about the monitoring by the UK government of local authority finances. The inquiry understands that the ministry monitored how funding provided to local authorities was spent and what financial pressures they faced. We understand that that information was important to the refinement and development of UK-wide economic interventions. I want to ask you about the practical effect of that monitoring on local authorities on the ground. Was it seen as burdensome? Was it seen as worth the effort?
So we, as the LGA and with councils, worked with MHCLG to design a survey that would allow the sort of capture of relevant information. The form of that survey, we iterated through it, but it became a really strong means for the department to be able to collect good, strong sort of data and evidence, both quantitative evidence, but also wraps around some qualitative evidence about how it felt to be there. Actually, response rates from councils were really high, never below 80%, and I think that gave a really strong picture into government about the financial pressures that we were facing. I think it also gave comfort actually to local government that true data and evidence was being used to enable the department to make good decisions in their own right, but also to be able to share that information more widely into other departments. However, the data set wasn't comprehensive. I think it didn't necessarily cover as much as there should have been that might have influenced the sort of behaviour of other departments. They relied less on data. They had, I think, insufficient information about what we do and how we did it, and I think that's still true today.
Ms. Killian, something we're particularly interested in arises from the report of David Phillips, who has provided an expert report to the inquiry on local government finance. He reflects on the data provided by local authorities in England and in Wales to central government as being important data sets that help to inform those governments in their development of economic interventions. His opinion is that similar measures in Scotland would also have been beneficial. And what these questions are intended to get towards is, was the burden on local authorities in producing this too much, or do you think the balance was struck correctly? It didn't feel so burdensome. It felt that there was purpose in gathering the data,
I think there were good conversations to make sure that the data was valuable for local authorities, but also for government. And as I said, we sort of iterated our way through it. It was a really strong evidence base. I think we would have been much more concerned had we not had the opportunities to put sort of accurate data through into government. I think where we felt much greater burdens, to be honest, was the amount of reporting that was required, particularly on the number of ring-fenced grants that local government had to deal with. So we were delighted some of our funding came unring-fenced, we could spend it, but actually the reporting regime around individual grants and programmes in some instances was incredibly burdensome. And actually the target of those grants were not, I think, sufficient to meet needs in local places. So I think we would have been more concerned about the burdens on grant reporting.
I'd like to ask you now about delays between the announcement of funds and guidance on their use. We're sticking with the Ministry for Local Government here. We'll move on to business grants later. What practical effect did delay have on local authorities?
I mean, at the time, authorities were under really significant pressure. As a serving chief exec at the time, we were redeploying people into frontline activities. We were really changing how we were supporting, including the most vulnerable people. Some of the announcements made were, I think, with good intent, but it would take a number of days before we actually got guidance. And to remember at that time, there were lots of guidance and instruction coming from various departments, not just about money, but other aspects of how we might change the way we work. So it felt there was lots of information coming. And the effect of it was expectations being raised with members of the public, expectations about how we would fill our duties were sometimes undermined. But I would say that MHCLG were much better than other departments about giving us notice and then using us to design some of the implementation as well.
That's the experience of this pandemic.
Yeah.
In future similar circumstances, how could that be improved?
So I think for us standing back, the principle must be that local government is involved in design, and that sort of design should be happening now. I think had we been involved slightly earlier on in some of the programmes, I think we could have tailored impact, and that, I think, would have relieved some of the worst aspects of the pandemic. So at this point, I would say that despite great sort of knowledge that has come out of the pandemic, we haven't been engaged as the LGA, or councils have not been engaged in translating all that learning into a process now that would allow us, if a pandemic arose, next month, in 6 months, I'm not sure that we'd be in a much better place because the learning hasn't been translated into the mechanisms we would use to behave differently.
On that note then, could we have a look at the Ministry's pandemic response framework? It's INQ 000625658, pages 27 to 28. Thank you. If we could highlight the first two paragraphs, thank you. And it reads as follows. This is a document produced in February of this year by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. As demonstrated during COVID-19, local authorities play a critical role in responding to pandemics. Their local leadership, knowledge of communities, and ability to quickly adapt and design services to meet local needs puts them at the forefront of response. From public health protection to economic growth, the expertise of local authorities is vast, meaning they can help tackle the full range of potential impacts on local people, places, and the economy. First question, what do you make of the recognition of the importance of local authorities in these paragraphs?
I think it's a powerful and sort of completely correct analysis of local government and how brilliant it is in local places, especially in a crisis.
Thank you. There's a part further down the page, beginning for any future pandemic response. And it reads as follows: for any future pandemic response, MHCLG will have a key role in emphasising to OGDs, that's other government departments, the importance of early engagement and co-design with local authorities, particularly where it is possible that local authorities will lead or support delivery. More broadly, MHCLG should produce a local engagement strategy, making use of established mechanisms. MHCLG must also closely monitor the financial impacts on local authorities. What do you make of the plan for the Ministry to play a key role in emphasising to other departments the importance of early engagement?
I mean, MHCLG, absolutely are a connector between local government and other departments. But it's also true, I think, that other government departments should invest time and energy and logic, actually, to understand local government, our powers, our capabilities, and the essential role that we play. I think there's consistent evidence in this module and in others that would flag that understanding was not sort of relevant, consistent, and actually I think it hindered the impact that we could make at a local level.
You can't give me an example of what you mean?
So, I mean, we might sort of cover it a little later, but say for this module, the Department of Business, as was then, saw us as a sort of delivery arm, like we were a contractor almost. They had an expectation that if we were sort of billing out to businesses, we would very automatically being able to collect revenue. It just didn't work like that. They didn't understand the complexity of our business. They didn't understand the local environment. They didn't understand our powers. And that became a sort of real frustration when there was so much pressure being sort of put on councils at the time. Another example would be in relation actually to one of these grants, the Department of Health and Social Care had made an assumption that councils would know every single market provider of care in their place. And in Surrey, there was 10,000 of them. It was not possible for us to be able to work in that way. So just being able to really understand what we do, how we do it, and particularly the nuance for us about things being super local. We can do things in a super local way that I think is misunderstood sometimes.
With that in mind, do you consider that this key role in emphasising to other government departments the importance of early engagement, do you think that's strong enough? Do you think there is enough detail of the how in there?
I think the sort of goal is laudable, isn't it? But it is about bringing life to that and requiring specific actions by other government departments. And in the playbooks that we have observed from other government departments, our role is still tiny if mentioned at all. So I think the goal is right. I think there's a huge amount of work to bring that to life quickly so that a major event could be managed in a very different way.
We will come on to discuss the Treasury and the Department for Business and Trade and their approach to local authorities in playbooks that have been produced. Sticking with the Ministry's playbooks, there's this one, and I think you've seen another one that I won't ask to be brought up on screen, the Financial Shocks Playbook, INQ 00031914. Have you had a chance to review those playbooks? What role has the Local Government Association played in the development of those playbooks?
We haven't played a role. We haven't been invited to play a role yet.
What do you make of that?
It's disappointing. It's disappointing, and something that is sort of also a priority for us to pursue with the department. But yeah, there has been no engagement from the LGA or, as I understand, from any other local authority in its development to date.
I'd like now to move to business grant schemes. The inquiry understands that there were 3 cohorts of those schemes. The first in spring 2020, the second autumn 2020, and the third December 2021. We understand that business grant schemes were designed by the Treasury before being handed to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, as it then was, to manage, with local authorities responsible for delivering the grants to businesses. Does that all sound correct?
It is correct.
Cohort 1 comprised the Small Business Grants Fund, announced as part of the budget on the 11th of March 2020. It also included the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant Fund, announced on the 17th of March 2020, and the Local Authority Discretionary Grant Fund, announced on the 1st of May 2020. The inquiry understands that the Local Government Association nor local authorities themselves were consulted in the design of any of these schemes. Is that your understanding?
It is my understanding, yes.
Thinking on a practical level, what value could the Local Government Association have brought to the design process if it had been involved?
So the really important backdrop to this is, councils were really concerned to support businesses in their economies. Of course, at the time, there was a great focus on delivering support to the most vulnerable people, but absolutely there was a recognition that businesses had to be supported to survive. So local government, of course, stepped forward and recognised the role that they should play to support businesses. But the reality was the systems and processes in place actually to collect business rates are distinct. There weren't systems and processes in place to be able to offer out grants. And I think there was a real misunderstanding that we could quickly change everything and provide the mechanisms to do this at speed and pace. So absolutely there was a willingness to do it. I think there was great disappointment about the fact that there had been no sort of involvement or engagement in design. And at the same time, of course, there was pressure from senior ministers for grants to be dispatched, as quickly as possible. And again, an understanding about why that was. So councils did make changes and improvise and set up systems, but it would have been much better if there had been earlier engagement in design. I think some of the asks were also quite countercultural. As a sector, we are very cognizant about the importance of managing fraud and errors in other processes that we run to distribute revenue. We always have these checks. So not only was the design, I think, we weren't encouraged to be part of the design process, but I think we were flagging really quite legitimate concerns that even though we're in a crisis, it was right, actually. There were some checks to ensure that money was going to the right places. And clearly, councils did not have all the data. Again, there was an assumption from HMT for Bays that we had all the information about all businesses in our places. And that just could not have been true. And again, councils weren't invited to describe those gaps or to provide solutions. So it felt very uncomfortable for councils in the first wave, particularly as a number of professionals were, ministers were making direct calls to them to encourage speed and pace, and it became an uncomfortable position. But recognising councils did really want to support their economies at the same time.
Can I, perhaps on that note, take you to a specific example of communication within central government that did not involve local government that perhaps should have done? Jenny Dibden was the co-director of the Cities and Local Growth Unit. That unit was jointly owned by Bays and MHCLG during the inquiry. Ms Dibden was responsible for the business grant schemes between March 2020 and March 2021. And in her witness statement to this module of the inquiry, she references an email exchange of the 7th of March 2020, so 4 days before the budget at which the first business grant scheme was announced. The email exchange involves officials from Bays, MHCLG and the Treasury. The emails discuss the development of the Small Business Grants Fund. Please could we have on screen paragraphs 5.11 to 5.12 of INQ 000-661243. Thank you. What we see here is Ms Dibden referencing an email exchange, and she begins towards the end of paragraph 5.11. HMT, the Treasury, also wrote, "My initial thinking was also that this would be easier if we gave local authorities more discretion, but perhaps with some guidelines about what kind of criteria we think they should use. Any thoughts about how we could be more specific about what we think local authorities might be able to do or achieve, whether they would welcome the funding or criticise us for expecting them to do the impossible?" And the reply from an official at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government comes, "I think it's hard to call how they, local authorities, would react. I think the more cumbersome you make it and the more pressure you put on local authorities to do it quickly, the harder it will be." With this specific example in mind, if, for example, the Chief Executive of the Local Government Association had been included in this email chain, could they have added value?
Absolutely, they could have added value. And, if colleagues from SIP for the accounting body had been brought along, I think we could have sort of persuaded them to do some design with us, and we could have done it sort of quickly and purposefully. I think the evidence given here on the flood recovery framework, that was a tiny thing compared to what was being sort of proposed for local government. And I think this sort of evidence, goes back to my earlier point about other government departments not knowing us, not understanding what we do, and actually not understanding, again, local government's willingness to do really difficult things.
Can I just interrupt you and press you a little further on the distinction between different departments?
Yes.
You've spoken positively about the Ministry for Local Government earlier. They're involved in this email exchange. Would you expect them to alert others to the need to consult with local authorities?
I am aware that MHCLG did sort of seek to broker on our behalf, but I think their view in other evidence statements is, HMT was setting a tax policy. And in this context, a grant scheme, Bays were delivering it and MHCLG were providing some sort of advocacy for us. But I think the force for speed and pace of this scheme came from Treasury and Bays. And I think some of the evidence here just does suggest a lack of understanding about what we do.
But would you have expected the ministry to be advocating for you in these circumstances?
Yes, absolutely. I would have expected it, and I believe that they did, but the impact was insufficient, clearly.
There's two counterpoints, as far as the inquiry can see, to the notion that local authorities should have been included in this email exchange, or generally in consultation on this measure. The first is that this was to be announced as part of the budget. Budgets attract a certain amount of confidentiality. To what extent do you regard that as justification for not consulting local authorities?
I mean, I think the context for that budget was wholly unique, wasn't it? I mean, the pandemic was starting to bear down, and it would have been appropriate, I think, to trust and have confidence that officials within local government could have held private and confidential information, could have been invited into a safe space to do the design, and I think it was an error that we weren't.
The second counterpoint, we've heard evidence, particularly last week, that there were at times in this acute period of the crisis, there was at times thought to be a trade-off between the value of pace and the value of consultation. And those two have been, in some quarters of the evidence, pitted against each other as equal and opposing notions. Do you accept the trade-off that consultation inevitably delays announcement of important funds?
I absolutely recognise the need for grants to be distributed quickly. I don't think we were searching for days and days of consultation, and a few hours in a room actually could have, I think, assisted in making the schemes much more purposeful and targeted. And there's evidence that the LGA and councils acted so quickly in responding to requests for information, advice in so many other circumstances. So I think provision could have been made to seek our advice and practical input, and it wouldn't have prejudiced the sort of the principle of getting stuff out the door as quickly as possible.
I'd like to move to the Cohort 2 grant schemes now, please. This is autumn of 2020. The same witness, Jenny Dibden, sets out her belief that local authorities were not consulted in the design of the Local Restriction Support Grant, which was announced on the 9th of September 2020. Firstly, from your own knowledge and speaking to others in preparing your statement, do you know if the Local Government Association was consulted in the design of this scheme?
I don't believe that we were consulted. No.
Could I ask for the Treasury's corporate statement, Annex F, to be brought up onto the screen? It's INQ 000-661-268. It's the part of their statement which deals with business grants. We're at pages 32 to 33, paragraph 109. This is the corporate statement provided by the Treasury to Module 9 of the inquiry. Paragraph 109. That same day, the Chancellor asked officials to work up the proposals and engage with selected local authorities, as well as other government departments, to get their input into policy design. At this stage, and as advised by MHCLG, it was considered impracticable to get input from all 300 plus authorities. So MHCLG suggested a small number who the Treasury could speak to in a more informal way during the policy development. Those selected had previously been vocal on grants issues. As set out later in this statement, the Treasury and MHCLG did engage with all local authorities to communicate on the scheme once it had been designed, and their feedback was used to refine later versions of the grant schemes. I think we can distill the following 3 facts from that paragraph. Firstly, the Chancellor asked for engagement with local authorities. Secondly, MHCLG suggested a small number for the Treasury to consult in policy development. And thirdly, there was engagement with all local authorities after the scheme had been designed. It's not clear from that paragraph alone whether consultation with local authorities on design actually took place. Can you help any further?
I'm not aware that the design took place, and I would have to sort of refer back, but I'm not aware there was any detailed design.
Thank you. So putting to one side consultation on design, local authorities do appear to have been engaged by central government on developing guidance after a scheme had been announced. What was the involvement of the Local Government Association in that kind of consultation, and was it effective?
So one of the frustrations was, guidance in this context too was released. Colleagues from the LGA and from councils had genuine queries about the design of the scheme. Those comments were fed through a variety of mechanisms, webinars, Q&A sessions, and schemes were often sort of varied, and that did lead to sort of frustrations. And, in cohort 2, for example, there were a number of sort of sub-schemes as well. So our role was often about trying to get to the detail and to get to sort of precision so that we could answer the questions that businesses and others were posing to us on a pretty frequent basis, locally too.
One of the recommendations that the Local Government Association makes in its statement is for announcement of schemes and guidance to be published at the same time. Is that feasible in a fast-moving, dynamic situation like this? Or is the real point to narrow the gap in time?
I think wherever possible, it should be the narrowest period of time. Sometimes announcements were made and we had to wait a number of days, weeks actually, for the detail. And I think that set such a difficult expectation with the public and in this context with businesses. And in some, at some moments we work in a political environment, we can understand that. But I think it was really unfortunate in setting expectations incorrectly and making people feel pretty unhappy.
I'd like to ask you now about the publication of data, which has become known in some quarters as the League Table. On the 20th of April 2020, data was published by the central government regarding the proportion of allocated funds that had been paid out to businesses by local authorities. Do you think this was a productive part of the economic response to the pandemic?
I think our view was it was a really unhelpful and sort of undermining process. I think there were a number of reasons why the performance in delivering grants varied. The economies were different, schemes were different in different areas at some points. And I think it put unnecessary pressure into councils who felt they had to respond to the league table positioning, press inquiries, political inquiries, and it really sort of, I think, detracted from the job of the day, which was to get grants out. And, a lot of staff were working overtime, working 7 days a week to get this through, and it was a really quite demoralising impact, actually.
On the notion of demoralising impact, the publication of a league table, the decision not to consult with local authorities in the design of business grant schemes. How did those two factors impact on the trust in the relationship between local authorities and the Department for Business and the Treasury?
So because some of the schemes were not designed correctly and had not understood the cohorts of business and the particular pressures they were facing. For example, for small businesses who were already in 100%, receiving 100% of business rate relief, in some schemes they weren't eligible, but they were the tiny small businesses that needed the cash most. There were other instances where an assumption had been made about small businesses who might be tenants. They weren't getting benefit, grants being sort of misdirected, I think, to large businesses, national, international businesses who really didn't need it. So it felt that some of the poor scheme design, the league tabling, actually diminished some trust between local businesses and councils. It sort of put pressure in between local government, BEIS and HMT, which was not necessary. And I think some of the actions that local government took, proved to be the correct thing. So, in the first cohort, pressure was on to get grants out. Fraud and error rates were high. As the schemes were better designed and local government were more involved and Treasury respected the sort of checks they were putting in place, fraud and error reduced. So it's a very difficult time, but I think having a league table in the middle of it and individual ministers calling people to put pressure on them really did not help, I don't think. But it goes back to this fundamental issue that if there had been moments of quick design, some of this could have been avoided, and better data.
In February of 2021, the Department of Business conducted a lessons learned exercise. It concluded there had been a lost opportunity to evaluate the Cohort 1 schemes between June and August 2020 and implement improvements, and that a formal lessons learned exercise ought to have been undertaken at that time. As a result of that review, the department established a programme board to provide oversight of local authority business grants, provide a mechanism for discussion, and it comprised officials from the Department for Business, the Treasury, local authority representatives. In principle, what are your views on that as a structure for engagement?
I mean, we welcomed the formation of the board and the fact that sort of colleagues from local government were invited to participate. I think their sort of practical knowledge sort of really helped the functioning of the board. But it was set up late in the process, wasn't it? And so as a mechanism, it was more positive than we'd experienced.
In practice, we know that the Cohort 3 business grant schemes were developed at short notice around the Christmas period 2021. They were designed by the Chancellor separately to the programme board. You've reflected on the positive aspects of the structure in principle. What are your reflections on the fact it wasn't used in practice?
I think, it was really disappointed. I think we'd participated in the board in good faith. We believe that was a sort of secure mechanism to deliver design, and it was therefore, I think, unfortunate that the Cohort 3 grants, some of the design there, I think, was not the best design, and had there been better input from local practitioners, I think the scheme would have landed in a different way.
Similarly to before, I'd like to now take you to a specific example of correspondence to illustrate the point, perhaps. It's an email chain at INQ 000543800. The date range is the 17th of December 2021 to the 7th of January 2022. And we're beginning here on pages 3 to 4 and working our way backwards. The email is from somebody we'll call Mr. X at the local government association. It's on the 17th of December and it's to an official at Bays, Anastasia Osborne. There is reference to a meeting on the 8th of December, and then this. I'm getting in touch as the LGA has been picking up that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been briefing that around £250 million of ARG, is that additional restrictions grant?
Yes, yes.
Is still outstanding and available for distribution. Within the context of calls for additional business grants to cope with the pressures caused by the current Plan B situation. This is an email, isn't it, from the LGA asking for clarity on how the Treasury is approaching the additional restrictions grant.
Yeah.
And I think we know there was no response to this email. Could we turn next to pages 2 to 3? A follow-up email between the same people on the 21st of December. It begins, "Hi Anastasia, I see from the Treasury website that there is a new up to £6,000 grant scheme to support businesses that are experiencing difficulties because of the Omicron variant. The estimated value is 683 million. And further on at the bottom, I am sure you are busy drafting the guidance. I wonder if there is a case for reconvening the previous local authority grants advisory group to discuss any drafts. I know that in previous rounds your colleagues found their input useful." And again, there was no response to this email, was there?
No, there was no response.
There was then an email on the 7th of January 2022, same person emailing the Bays official, thanking her for the publication of the guidance on the new Omicron Hospitality and Leisure Grant, and asking for further discussion to be had and raising issues with it. Finally, in this series of emails is the response, shortly thereafter, about 9 minutes afterwards, from Anastasia Osborne. "As you will appreciate, we were pushed to get the schemes off the ground quickly over the holiday period, which was challenging. In regards to the criteria, ARG, which sits alongside the Hospitality and Leisure Grant, gives local authorities flexibility to give grants to the businesses you have mentioned. In regards to the advisory group, the team will be now focused on communication and engagement, and I will make them aware of the concerns being raised." How do you reflect on this series of interactions?
Again, I think we were all really concerned going into that period of time about, again, the impact on businesses. We were concerned that we hadn't been engaged, and initially some of the data and assumptions that the Treasury were using about previous use of the grant were incorrect and using old data, I think, from August. I think councils by this time were even more experienced and understanding of the very specific issues in their places that would have benefited from, a purposefully designed grant scheme with maximum, I think, discretion. But again, at a crucial time, we were not engaged and invited, I think, just to be communicated with.
I won't ask for it to be brought up on screen, but on the 31st of January 2022, there was a meeting of the programme board, and a Treasury official responded to the concerns being raised by this Mr. X person. And he responded that the decision around eligible business sectors was out of Bays's control, i.e. for the Treasury. The context in which decisions were taken was during a period of economic uncertainty and public media scrutiny. The priority for the Chancellor was to deliver the funds to businesses as quickly as possible, with little time for consultation. A different approach would have significantly delayed the delivery of the scheme. So we see here again the purported trade-off between time to consult and speed of delivery. Do you accept that trade-off? Particularly given the context of we're now in December 2021, not March 2020.
I think because we are at this point in December 2021, we should have learnt to live with, an equal design process. I think at this point, there should have been processes that would have enabled us absolutely to sort of contribute to the design. And the Omicron hospitality programme that was eventually rolled out, I think didn't consistently meet the needs of businesses in places. There were some flaws in the programme. And I think had we been involved in design, then some of those issues could have been alleviated. And I think that businesses and the public were so frustrated at that point. I could understand, the need for speed, but actually elements of the programme actually didn't meet what businesses and members of the public had expected or wanted. So I think we were really concerned that, after 18 months of doing this, it didn't feel that much had changed.
Putting it bluntly, is the point maybe that it's all well and good having a board and a structure which can work and which has structures built into it, but it needs earnest buy-in from the Treasury to be effective?
I mean, principally the board had been set up by BEIS. I don't think, it had a mandate, a specific mandate from HMT, so it was their board. So it shouldn't have been circumvented, and it's unfortunate that it was.
Do you think that lack of a mandate from HMT is a weakness in that structure?
I think it is a weakness, and it's a lesson for the future, isn't it, about the importance of having arrangements that could be stood up that have clear terms of reference and a clear locus to avoid sort of confusion and other avenues to deal with a policy or a practice issue.
I want to ask you about the playbooks produced by the Department for Business and Trade in draft form. So it's important to note that these are not purporting to be the finished article. First is the draft pandemic playbook, INQ 000661558, page 17, paragraph 96, which states this: local authorities have the local knowledge on businesses in their area and are therefore likely to remain a critical delivery partner in the business support element of any future pandemic response. However, as far as the inquiry understands, and we'd be interested in your reading of the playbook, reference is not made to how local authorities will be engaged. Firstly, is that your reading of it? And secondly, what do you make of that?
It is my understanding. I think there's sort of scant reference to local government in this playbook. And that's sort of a concern, given all the knowledge and experience that should have been accrued through this period of time.
The second playbook I'd like to ask you to look at, also produced by the Department of Business and Trade, INQ 000661559, page 4, paragraph 214. Also, it's important to note, in draft form. It states this: where schemes are to be administered by local authorities, regular engagement will be via established MHCLG network routes, LGA, and directly through dedicated forums and webinar delivery sessions. And if we just hold that in our minds and go to para 222, which states that the Grant Delivery Directorate owns capabilities which have been used for responses to individual company economic shocks and emergency localised flooding support, as well as wider economy systemic shocks such as the 2008 financial crisis, COVID-19, and emergency energy support, and has strong connections with MHCLG and local authorities. Firstly, has the Local Government Association had any involvement in the development of these playbooks?
It has not.
Do you support the sentiment of the playbooks?
I support the sentiment, but I think the language of engaging and communicating in the previous paragraph doesn't sort of recognise the role that we should have in design. I think it's absolutely crucial that the playbooks make space for our knowledge and the knowledge of businesses to be part of their sort of planning. So it doesn't make me feel comfortable. In relation to 2.2.2, they may have strong connections with MHCLG, but we don't have consistently strong relationships from the LGA or from local authorities with this particular directorate or bays, and that's something I think we've got to correct.
Final topic of questioning before we have a break. And you'll know that after the break, we'll be hearing from Dr. Chris Llewellyn from the Welsh Local Government Association. This is a prelude to that evidence, essentially. We understand from the survey of local authorities that's been provided to the inquiry that Welsh local authorities were much more positive about engagement on business grants with the Welsh Government than were English local authorities. Why do you think there is that distinction?
Some of it is about scale. There are fewer Welsh authorities. The government, in a sense, is closer. The scale and volume of businesses, grants that had to be delivered in England was much more significant. The same for grants to local authorities. But my impression is that the Welsh Government had a more consistent way to sort of engage early, talk, design, and a different expectation about local government as really good delivery partners.
Ms. Killeen, thank you. My lady, those are my questions.
Can I ask, Ms. Killeen, can I use you? I'm very wary of making recommendations where you can't see on whose desk it's going to land and how it's going to be implemented and how you monitor whether a recommendation is implemented. And I get your message is what we need is better engagement at an earlier stage in design and the like of schemes such as this, especially with the local authorities who are going to be delivering it. How can I make a recommendation that would get that message across and implemented? Have you any thoughts as to how practically it could work, apart from just saying you should engage more with local authorities when you're designing a scheme they're going to be delivering?
I think that is a great question, but with your permission, could we go away and think about that? Because it's so crucial, and make a submission back to you.
No, I think that would be an excellent idea. And of course, there'd be the opportunity to make closing submissions. Mr. Ober, I'm sure, would put it forward any good ideas you have. I want to make sure that if I do agree with you, and if I do make a recommendation, that we can make it, I think the modern word is land.
Yes, and with your permission, can I just come back on one point? I think that's so important. We've quite rightly spent a lot of time talking about grants to businesses, but I think there were so many lessons learnt about how grants to support super vulnerable people were not designed as well. So if we could offer back some suggestions on both, that would be really powerful and helpful, I think.
If you can, I'd be really grateful. I appreciate it may be too difficult, but I appreciate your help.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for the help that you've given so far and your organisation have given to the inquiry, and I wait to hear whether you've got some more help to give. Thank you very much indeed. Very well, we shall break now and I shall return at 15:15. All rise. Ms Wilson.
Thank you, my lady. The next witness is Dr. Chris Llewellyn.
I do solemnly,
Sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you for coming back to help us, Mr Llewellyn.
Thank you.
You are Dr. Chris Llewellyn,
Yes, that's correct.
the Chief Executive Officer of the Welsh Local Government Association. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
You've provided, I think, 9 statements to the inquiry now, one of which is to Module 9 with reference number INQ 000653255. Is that
That's
correct?
correct, yes.
And in fact, this is your 4th time giving evidence to the inquiry.
That's also correct.
Can I thank you for the assistance you've given so far? Membership of the Welsh Local Government Association, the WLGA, is voluntary as I understand it.
Yeah, that's correct.
But all 22 local authorities in Wales and additionally 3 fire and rescue authorities and the 3 national park authorities are members.
That's right.
I just want to start, please, by asking you about the role of the WLGA in the economic response. And in your statement, you described the role of the WLGA officers as an honest broker. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yes, the WLGA acts as an interface between the member bodies, the 22 local authorities, the national parks and the fire and rescue services. It acts as an interface between those bodies and the Welsh Government in particular, but other tiers of government and other national bodies as well. And in a sense, it provides a mechanism rather than each tier of government or any national bodies having a bilateral relationship with each one of the 22 authorities. The WLGA acts on their behalf. The association isn't a public body as such. It's a membership organisation, so its status is slightly different. We may come on to it, but the Government of Wales Act and the arrangement surrounding the Partnership Council and the statutory partnership scheme identifies the WLGA as the voice of local government, so it provides a legal underpinning, a status, if you like. But in a broader sense, we act as the voice of local government, but very often we have no formal decision-making role, but as I say, we act as that interface between various bodies and local government.
I want to come on actually next to ask you about the structures for engagement, in particular the use that was made of those pre-existing formal structures. You've touched on there the Government of Wales Act that requires the Welsh Government to engage with local authorities, including the WLGA, through the Partnership Council for Wales. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But particularly relevant for our module is a subgroup of that forum, the finance subgroup of the Partnership Council for Wales. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
That was a forum which usually met about 3 to 4 times per year prior to the pandemic. Yeah. But in the pandemic, there was just one extra meeting in the financial year 2020 to 2021. Who decides the frequency of those meetings?
The reality is that they're normally agreed by consensus. There is a prescribed approach, but the nature of the relationship is one that a consensus emerges. One of the, if I can just elaborate, one of the big things that the local WLGA, Local Government Association, does is negotiate the revenue settlement for local authorities every year, and that's been the case since the advent of devolution, and it's these mechanisms that sit under the Partnership Council that facilitate those discussions.
So there was a meeting on the 5th of February 2020, very much business as usual. The next meeting, which was the one additional meeting, was on the 30th of April 2020. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So that takes us to about a month after the first national lockdown. And you stressed in your evidence to earlier modules of this inquiry that the earlier the engagement, the better the outcome. But what do you make of the timing of that additional meeting?
The reality was the same partners or the same members would have met in other guises at an earlier point. So I don't think that the timing of the meeting was of any undue concern.
So, if I understand your evidence correctly, the engagement was in fact far wider than those pre-existing formal structures. Is that right?
Yes. So the finance subgroup is normally chaired by the minister with responsibility for local government, and from the local government side, at that point there would have been 9 of the 22 leaders would have been members of the finance subgroup. There would have been a few other members as well, and they would have met in, as I say, in other guises prior to that and subsequently as well.
What sort of other forums or mechanisms of meeting would have existed?
We convened bilateral meetings between the 22 leaders, or different configurations of the 22 leaders, and service ministers. There are meetings with the local government minister on a regular basis, and I think in the various evidence submissions that we've made, we've set out the frequency of meetings between the local government minister and the 22 leaders at various points during the pandemic. Those meetings took place on a daily basis, and we could stand them up at very short notice, sometimes within a matter of hours. As a consequence, there was considerable and regular dialogue with the Minister for Local Government.
So was it the case then that the discussions from those ad hoc, sometimes daily meetings, bilateral meetings, would be then formalised in the formal structure, which
that's right, yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you now about the quality of engagement? We heard some evidence this morning from Ms Killian, who said that some of the UK government departments did not understand the complexity of local authority business, and as we heard this morning, that became a source of frustration. Can I ask you about your experience in Wales? Was that the same or different?
I think it's fair to say that my impression is that it was different. For obvious reasons, my experience and understanding of the Welsh context is different, and my understanding of the position in England at a UK level is more distant. But as we've already touched on, we had pre-existing mechanisms and arrangements in Wales for which frames the relationship between local government and central government in the form of the Welsh government. So we had a level of understanding in place prior to the pandemic. It's also, I think, important to note that the local government minister at the time, Julie James, was a former senior officer within local government and had an extensive knowledge of the way that local government worked, and was exceptionally receptive to our approaches throughout her term in office. But there were other ministers. The first minister himself, Mark Drakeford, was a former county councillor. There were other ministers as well who were former councillors. So there were structural processes in place which facilitated the relationship, and then that was enhanced, I think, by the experience of senior ministers within the Welsh Government as well.
So unlike the evidence we heard this morning about England, your experience in Wales was that there was a good understanding, not only in the department responsible for local government, but also across the Welsh Government. Is that right?
That's right, more broadly as well. If I can elaborate on that point, as I say, the local government minister of the day, Julie James, was very receptive to any approaches from local government, and she acted as an advocate for local government within the Welsh Government and within the Cabinet, but also acted as a conduit as well in facilitating discussion and relationship with other relevant service ministers as well. But beyond that, historically as well, as an association, we've always had bilateral relations with other ministers as well, so with the Education Minister, with the Minister for Health and Social Care, and so on. So there was a substantial foundation in place before the start of the pandemic.
Thank you. Can I move on now to ask you about the design of the Local Government Hardship Fund, which, as I understand it, was one of the means by which the Welsh Government provided additional funding to local authorities in response to the pandemic. As far as you're aware, was the Welsh Local Government Association involved in the initial design of that scheme prior to launch?
Yes. I think it's important to say that the Hardship Fund worked well throughout the period and developed and grew during the course of the pandemic. And I think we'd had experience in the February of 2020 with Storm Dennis, which I think has cropped up in other modules, in other evidence sessions. One of the things that happens during such crises is that a scheme, an emergency financial assistance scheme, the EFAS scheme, is stood up, as it were. It used to be referred to as the Belwyn scheme. And I think that provided, in a sense, a precursor to the hardship scheme. There was recent experience of a claims-based approach to supporting local governments, and that was very fresh in people's minds, and I think it provided the basis for the Hardship Fund going forward.
Can we please bring up INQ 000588-134? Dr. Llewellyn, this is a very short extract from the report of David Phillips, who's the inquiry's local government finance expert. And he provides a view there, comparing and contrasting the different approaches to funding. But at paragraph 164.1, he states the Welsh approach was most responsive to asymmetric impacts, as the largest component of funding was based on individual local authorities' reported costs and income losses. However, funding on this basis comes with a trade-off, as it reduces the incentive of local authorities to have to control additional expenditures and minimise income losses. I just want to break that down and ask for your view on it. You've mentioned there that there was some experience baked into the Hardship Fund about the claims-based process, but it's right, isn't it, that it was sensitive to local needs?
Yes, that's right.
What's mentioned there is the trade-off, and that there was a greater administrative trade-off required as a result of submitting claims rather than a formula-based approach. Do you think the right balance was struck?
Yeah, yes, I do. I think the claims-based approach is very effective. I think there's an implicit criticism in this comment, which I think is harsh. And I'd say it's a very conservative with a small c approach to local government funding. It has to be borne in mind as well that authorities were funded through the revenue support grant, which, again, to the Welsh Government's credit, was paid in advance rather than in arrears, which again was beneficial to local authorities. But we know, as I mentioned, through the EFA scheme, that the claims-based approach worked effectively. It was tried and tested, and I think both the Welsh Government and local authorities thought that it worked effectively. I noted that in her written evidence to this module, the then Minister Julie James commented very positively and favourably on this arrangement.
The scheme grew, though, didn't it, quite
Yeah,
considerably,
yes.
from, I think, a £30 million fund initially to over a £900 million fund in the end, including multiple different elements, I think 28 at one point. And it obviously increased in complexity, didn't it?
It does, and from a local government perspective, we always argue for funding to be as streamlined as possible to minimise complexity and bureaucracy, so that as much of the funding gets to the operational side and is spent on delivery. So we're always eager to minimise bureaucracy as much as possible. And I think in this instance, with the hardship fund, I think that was achieved. And what we saw as it developed was funding coming from various other service areas and being channeled through the hardship scheme. It is worth mentioning as well that there was a sort of a star chamber approach as well to adjudicating and overseeing the claims, and there was a sense of trust and confidence built into that star chamber approach for a number of reasons, and I think the trust and confidence is a theme that runs throughout the hardship fund and the business grants that were distributed in Wales. But part of the reason was because there were two former local government finance directors as part of that star chamber. So it gave confidence to government and it gave confidence to local authorities as well. I think on occasion some claims were rejected, but very few. And I think from the local government perspective, it was seen as a fair and an effective mechanism.
Thank you. You've mentioned their business grants delivered by local government, and I want to come on to ask you about those. Can I have on screen, please, INQ 000653255, paragraph 124. This is your statement, Dr. Llewellyn, and I want to ask you about this because we've received a range of evidence as to whether delivery partners were consulted in the design of the schemes at the outset. And you say there that there was a tendency, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, for the Welsh Government to suggest economic interventions and then inform local government what support and how much was being made available. However, as the joint working developed over time, there was then the opportunity to feed into thinking on subsequent rounds. So just starting with, why was it important for local governments in Wales or the WLGA to feed into the Welsh Government's thinking on the design of those schemes?
Because local authorities, local government have a better understanding of the people, communities and businesses they represent than central government. We use an expression which has cropped up, I think, in other evidence sessions, that the role of central government is to set the strategy nationally, but then the role of local government is to interpret that strategy based on local circumstances. So we would say the same thing here, that elected members and officers are rooted in their communities. They have an understanding of their communities. It extends to knowledge about the local businesses, how they operate, and so on. So that's why we think they're better placed to inform the detail of policies while accepting that it's the role of government to set the national strategy.
And just looking what you said there in the first sentence, do you think the engagement and involvement in the initial design of the business schemes was sufficient, or would you have liked to have more of a co-design role?
Inevitably, I think, with in any situation, things can be improved. I thought we heard Joe from the LGA several times this morning talking about the importance of early engagement. It's been a feature of discussions in other modules as well. I think the Permanent Secretary in the Welsh Government in one of her evidence statements conceded the point that she, in hindsight, she thought that it would have been better to have engaged with the WLGA at an earlier point in the crisis and then on a more regular basis going forward. So I think that that's always the case. But I think that in this instance, lessons were learned very, very quickly, and the arrangements that were then put in place worked very effectively.
And speaking of the arrangements that were put in place, that included an oversight group, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So we were involved in setting up an oversight group which involved the key partners, so Welsh Government, Business Wales, local authorities and the WLGA, and I think that oversight group worked very well. And then every time there were changes in circumstances, depending on the nature of the different lockdowns and the fire breaks, they were able to respond very, very quickly, very sensitively. I used the phrase earlier, trust and confidence. I think there was a trust and confidence among the partners within the oversight group, so they were able to test ideas in an open and trusted way, and I think it worked very effectively.
And so was that the forum through which the business support schemes were adapted, or new ones were designed and developed?
Yeah, it is. But it's worth mentioning as well that there was political oversight as well. So there were parallel processes because, again, as I think I've emphasised, elected members, leaders are so aware of the business needs within their communities and within their wards in particular. And very often as well, businesses know who their elected members are. And I think that helped the process in this instance. And there are advantages. I think Joe this morning mentioned again the scale differences between England and Wales because of the differences in scale.
Well, I just want to come on to ask you about that, and it might be useful if we look at the survey which your organisation kindly prepared for the inquiry. Can we bring up, please, INQ 000596485? This is from the key findings of the survey, and it highlights the evidence that we've heard this morning. Almost 3/4 of English authorities, 71%, thought that central government engaged not very well or not at all well with local government. But by contrast, 86% of the Welsh authorities felt that the Welsh Government engaged very or fairly well with them. Now, you've mentioned trust and confidence, but I just want to gain the benefit of your experience and expertise. Why do you think this worked a lot? The engagement was much more positive in Wales than in England.
I think it's a complicated question, and there are many aspects to it. We've already mentioned there's an issue of scale. Wales is small, 22 unitary authorities, a population of 3 million. So inevitably, I think the relationship between local government and the Welsh Government is closer than may be the case elsewhere. There are also structural reasons. I think, I touched on earlier the Government of Wales Act, the statutory partnership scheme. The Partnership Council, the various structures that sit under the Partnership Council and the way they'd operated since 1999, the way it formally recognises the role of the WNGA as the voice of local government. There are cultural reasons, I think, as well. Within Wales, there is an emphasis on partnership working. As an association, we've always argued that we deliver the best outcomes for the people of Wales when all tiers of government work in partnership. We also emphasise working in partnership with other sectors as well. We've always had a close relationship with the voluntary sector and with the business sector. We're big supporters of the principles of social partnership, and I think all of those proved to be beneficial during the pandemic. There are also what you might refer to as sort of attributes of atmosphere. We were able to create an atmosphere of trust and confidence, both at a political level, but among officers as well. In our evidence, we've mentioned the role of the 151 officers, the Society of Welsh Treasurers. The Society of Welsh Treasurers, their executive, our officials within the WNGA and Welsh Government officials were able to meet on a regular basis, sometimes daily, with complete trust and confidence, knowing that they could test and discuss ideas with the confidence that they wouldn't escape elsewhere. And I think that the overall focus on outcomes throughout the improving outcomes for people and communities, I think, was never lost at any tier of government, so worked particularly well in this instance.
Thank you, Dr. Llewellyn. Those are my questions. My lady, I understand there are some questions from the call participants.
Yep, there's one from Miss Beattie. Miss Beattie's just there. Dr. Llewellyn.
Dr. Llewellyn, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. You emphasise throughout your statement the value of co-production between local authorities and central government in coordinating the pandemic response, given the particular expertise and local knowledge of councils. And you also emphasise the importance of the Welsh Local Government Association's links to professional and political groups and to voluntary sector organisations to ensure a timely and effective pandemic response. Do you agree that the involvement of frontline and representative organisations, such as DPO, in planning and delivery of emergency responses is essential to ensure that the diverse needs of local communities are properly understood and met?
Yes, I do. I mentioned that we're big advocates of social partnership. And in a lot of our sort of corporate documentation, but our policy approach, we always argue the case. We think that the people who use services and those people who are directly involved in the delivery of services are the people who understand services best and should have as much of the say as possible in the way that those services are delivered and organised.
So does it make them more effective, and as well as meeting local need?
Well, we would argue we do to deliver better outcomes and more effective and efficient services if we engage service users and, as I say, those who directly provide services as well.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. Dr. Llewellyn, that concludes the questions we have for you. I've got a feeling, isn't your organisation still helping the inquiry on Module 10?
I think we are, actually, yeah.
Sorry.
You may see me again.
Well, I'm really grateful to you for the help you've given so far, and if you are going to come back, I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Lady.
Thank you very much for your help. Awesome.
My lady, I understand the next witness is on the link. So
Cheers.
we will make the arrangements for those to be brought in.
Ms Dickey, can you see and hear me?
Can, yes, good morning.
We'll just wait for Mr Hudson to get into place and make sure you can see and hear him.
Ms. Dickey, can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can, yes, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
If you speak up a bit, I'm sure I can.
Yeah. Can you hear me? I'm just going to read the affirmation to you.
Thank you.
If you could please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming back to help us, Ms Dickey, and for moving your time, I think. Thank you for your cooperation. Mr Hudson.
Thank you, my lady. You are Nicola Dickey, is that right?
Yes.
You are the Director of People Policy at the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, COSLA. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
You have provided a statement to the inquiry on behalf of COSLA. That's INQ 000616 Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Ms Dickey, I'm going to launch straight into financial monitoring of local authorities by the Scottish Government. The inquiry understands that during the pandemic, COSLA organised a number of surveys of local authorities on their spending and income pressures. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Why did COSLA collect this information?
Well, I think it was important for our organisation to understand exactly where our 32 member councils were, given the significant economic shocks that were going on across not just our own sector, but others. That it was important for us to have that information so that we could lobby government, so that we could provide that information to government, and so we could ensure that other local authorities were aware of the position across the board.
Was the information collected on COSLA's own initiative, or was it requested by the Scottish Government?
As far as I recall, it was a combination of COSLA recognising that we needed to do it for our own purposes, and it was also helping us to continue the discussions that we had ongoing with government. I don't recall a formal request coming from government, but certainly there were ongoing daily conversations at a senior level across the organisation, so it was a bit of both probably.
Is there a particular reason why COSLA would be engaged to collect that information rather than Scottish Government doing it directly?
So one of the main purposes of our organisation is to be the collective voice for local government in Scotland, and like similarly to colleagues in the LGA and the Welsh LGA, we are that voice, and it's better to come through COSLA as opposed to having 32 individual conversations, particularly when you're working at the pace that we all were during the pandemic.
Would it be accurate to characterise the collection of information by COSLA as ad hoc rather than systematic?
I think that would be fair, yes. It's not a primary aim of our organisation to gather data on our member councils.
How did local authorities react to the requirement to complete the surveys organised by COSLA?
So we are their membership organisation, so it was in conversation with their elected members and indeed their chief executives that we agreed collectively that we needed to have that information. So whilst they were busy, they recognised the value in us having that information. So I don't recall any adverse reaction then or now when we ask local authorities to send us information that helps us to form positions.
Did you have concerns at any point about the risk of overburdening local authorities with reporting requirements at a stressful time?
Yes, I think that's always a concern, and we were really clear that the surveys weren't completed every week or every month. We were fairly strategic when we went and asked for things, as much as you could be on the basis that the pandemic was continually changing. But as I say, it was done in collaboration with the 32 chief executives of the councils. So they they would have had ample opportunity to come back to us and say what we were requesting was onerous.
To your knowledge, what benefit did the Scottish Government derive from the information collected by COSLA?
Well, I suppose at least the first thing I would say is that they had a single point of truth. So they could see all 32 returns and they could compare and contrast. In Scottish local government, we have kind of local government families, so local authorities where the demographics or the services that are provided are very similar. So it allowed them to compare and contrast and feed into some of the as much planning as could be done. Excuse me.
As useful as that may have been, would you accept the proposition that it would have been more useful had the data been systematically collected? So you would have a complete data set, whether that be weekly or monthly, but there is a full picture over a 12-month period.
I think I would need to understand what that systematic information was going to be used for. So whilst the pandemic changed quickly, it did not change on a week-by-week basis. I suspect that had we been gathering it weekly, a lot of that information would have been gathered and probably not utilised to the extent to warrant the time investment that had taken place at a local level. So I'm not disagreeing, but I don't believe in collecting data for data's sake, least not because these teams were working from dawn till dusk, delivering, financial contributions to individuals, to employees, and indeed to businesses.
Well, Ms Dickey, that chimes with a point that was made to us yesterday by Kate Forbes, the current Deputy First Minister, and then the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and later the Economy too. Please could we have her witness statement up at pages 36 to 37, INQ 000653414. And I'm going to begin by quoting from every one person. Every one person involved in reporting was one fewer person involved with distributing the funding at a time when businesses really needed the funding. She states that she was, quote, reluctant to focus any efforts away from frontline teams who were distributing funding by imposing onerous reporting requirements. The volume of work was so overwhelming that it would have been foolhardy to impose increased, I think she means, reporting requirements at the beginning. Do you share that view?
Yes, I do. I suppose what it's important to remember is that local government employees are public servants who deal with public money all of the time. So there are checks and balances that are built in as business as usual process. And I think the trust and the working relationships that are there, our directors of finance or our section, finance section leads, they're responsible for public money. So I think that there's an element of, we were really clear that there were a degree of check and balance in the fact that there were councils that were used to dealing with public money. I think it goes back to the point about collection of data. If you're collecting data to report and then start to publish some sort of league tables, I believe LGA commented on that this morning, that was unhelpful. We were not in a situation where that happened in Scotland, so I do agree with what the Deputy First Minister has said in her statement.
I just want to make sure we're clear on our focus here. The league table issue that was raised this morning was in relation to the distribution of business grant schemes. I'm asking about the monitoring of information by the Scottish Government of income pressures and funding requirements of local authorities. Could I put to you a contrasting approach and ask for your view on that? And it's this. The UK government, via the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, did collect systematic financial monitoring returns from local authorities in England. The evidence we have received from the UK government seems to indicate that was an important part of central government developing its response as the pandemic went on. And we heard evidence this morning that you may well have heard as well, that in the view of the Local Government Association, representing English local authorities, the balance was well struck there. It wasn't overly burdensome, and they could see the value in it both to central government and to local authorities. In your view, is there any reason why such information wouldn't be equally helpful to the Scottish Government?
No, I think that information would be helpful to the Scottish Government, but I would say that that information has its limitations and it needs to be contrasted with what is that data return actually telling you. So I wouldn't swap one for the other, if that makes sense. I think it is important to have that data available, but it's also important to make sure that the conversations are ongoing, to make sure that everybody understands that data, which was a space that we were in from a Scotland-wide level. We were able to have conversations with the Deputy First Minister to explain, why particular local authorities were particularly affected by a loss of income on, a particular service, or why another local authority was not impacted. So I think it needs to be systematic data alongside conversation and narrative, because I actually don't know that unless you understand the 32 local authorities the way our council leaders and our chief execs do, that the data would necessarily tell you the whole picture.
What I'm most pointedly driving at is the inquiry has received an expert report on local government finance from David Phillips. In it, he recommends that the inquiry recommends that the systematic collection of financial monitoring data is undertaken by Scotland in the same way that it was in England and Wales in the event of a future pandemic level emergency. Do you wish to argue against that recommendation?
No.
Can I move on then? I'd like to put to you an issue with the economic response as framed by Jonathan Belford. He was the Chief Officer for Finance, the Section 95 officer for Aberdeen City Council. His inquiry witness statement is INQ 000657855. And he says this: throughout the pandemic, quantum of funding was a common topic. Moving on. I do accept that funding that the Scottish Government was distributing was based on what they were receiving. But it was frustrating at times when there were gaps between the value received and our understanding of how much had been committed to funding schemes by the Scottish Government. If I remember correctly, this lack of transparency made it difficult to interpret or understand what was still being considered for distribution. The frustration arose from the void of information and left local authorities questioning if they were going to be supported to the level that was necessary or not. Firstly, do you recognise that as an issue that COSLA was aware of at the time?
Yes.
Do you agree with the way that Mr Belford frames it?
I think I can remember the level of frustration from our Section 95 officers. I don't think it's clear there whether we're talking about the funding that was going to local government for loss of income and increased cost, or are we talking about the money that was going through local government for distribution out into the community, be that individuals or to businesses? So I don't take any issue with anything that Jonathan has covered there, and things were moving particularly fast, but those were ongoing conversations that we were having at a senior level between COSLA and Scottish Government officials.
And against the backdrop of a situation that was inherently uncertain during the pandemic, what's your view on how well the Scottish Government managed that uncertainty insofar as it filtered through to local authorities and then to businesses?
I think Scottish Government made a really good attempt to make sure that local government understood where they were most of the time. I think the landscape was confusing. We were getting announcements made from the UK government that was then funneling down into announcements being made by the Scottish Government. That was then coming through and out into the 32 local authorities. So I think there's always room for improvement in terms of communication, but I feel that the Scottish Government did their did their best to make sure that they were clear what was coming to local government.
You've said there's room for improvement. I don't necessarily wish to put you on the spot, but have you got any ideas about how that improvement could be achieved in the event of future pandemic?
I think there's an element of, in particular when we're thinking about business grants, when announcements are being made, they should be made in a way that is a bit more general. So there's going to be a business grant scheme for X or Y, and it will be open in 2 weeks' time. So you could say to hospitality, there is something coming, and we will provide the guidelines in 2 weeks, because I get the political imperative and indeed the need for businesses to have surety that there is support coming. But very often, if I give the example of business grants for hospitality, that announcement would be made, and almost immediately councils were then fielding phone calls from hospitality businesses in their local area asking for additional support. So I think it's about providing certainty to sectors that there is funding coming, and then being clear that the window for application will open at a further stage to allow us to get into the co-design and co-production in many cases that was done rapidly after announcements were made. So that's the type of example that I'm talking about. You know, the communities and indeed the business community were desperate for information. So ministers had to say what was coming, but a bit of a time lag in terms of when applications would be open, etc., would allow local government time to prepare and take a lot of frustration out from our business communities.
So is it perhaps providing confidence to businesses and certainty whilst managing expectations?
Yes.
On the issue of issues experienced in relation to announcements and then the later provision of funds, could I ask you to look at INQ 000616-704, your witness statement? It's paragraph 3.10. You say this: there were, however, times when the Scottish Government made announcements about financial support measures, such as the £500 thank you payment to health and social care workers, without prior engagement and with little knowledge of the complexities involved in implementing the payment. The £500 payment was announced by the First Minister on the 30th of November 2020, but was not paid until the end of the financial year due to the difficulties associated with implementing the payment and the burden this placed on local authorities as the implementation agencies. COSLA leaders considered this matter in December 2020, January and February 2021, before being in a position to clear the payment to the workforce. Firstly, what were the difficulties in implementing this payment?
The difficulties were both from a policy perspective, who was included in the social care workforce. Did that include those who worked in children's social care? So there were kind of policy issues that had to be kind of ironed out. Did people have to have been working for a certain length of time? So there were some policy questions that needed to be asked and answered. And then there were the practical difficulties in making a payment to a very diverse workforce. So we had local government social care staff, we had private social care staff, and indeed voluntary and charitable sector social care staff. So the actual practicalities of getting that £500 payment out through our suppliers into the pay packets of employees. So policy and practical issues to be ironed out.
Thinking back to this moment in time, 30th of November 2020, can you think why, on this occasion, the First Minister, the Scottish Government, didn't engage with local authorities before making the announcement?
So I think, I don't know if it's accurate to say that they didn't engage. I think there were conversations that took place at a senior level, at an official level, that this was something that was in the minds of ministers. But again, if I go back to the pace, things were being announced. I suspect that those conversations didn't then get into the level of detail that would have been required, and hence why we had to have kind of 3 goes of going round COSLA leaders to iron out some of those issues.
What I'm driving at is that I think in your statement you highlight this as an exception to the rule. I think you state that there was generally good engagement, but on occasion it was less good. And I'm trying to ask for your view on why this was an exception to the rule? Is it to do with the people involved, the structures?
No, I genuinely don't think it. I can't recall why this exception came up. I suppose elsewhere in the statement we're alluding to the actual number of announcements around about business grants that were going out. This one was slightly different in that it was for the individual as opposed to a grant for the business. But I genuinely don't recall that there was anything specific other than probably the speed that everybody was going at and announcements being made. I genuinely don't recall there being, a specific issue that comes to mind.
And does it follow from your answer earlier about the value that local authorities can bring, the advantage to businesses and people receiving the support in certainty, confidence, but also managed expectations, that you would like to see this example avoided in the future?
Yes, I think it would have been. It was regrettable that people were promised £500 and we were in a position where we weren't able to deliver that to the end of the financial year. Given the pressure that social care as a workforce were under, I think it was unfortunate that we weren't in a case where we could get the money out the door much quicker.
It seems that you were listening to the evidence earlier and that you can see my lady's interest in the how. What mechanism could be in place to ensure that an example like this is avoided in the future?
So I think we already have that mechanism post-pandemic in Scotland. So our business as usual processes in Scotland are that Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers regularly liaise with COSLA, and a couple of years back we signed something called the Verity House Agreement, which is a public statement about the engagement that will happen between Scottish Government and COSLA. So it might be worth the inquiry having a look at that. In practice, our business as usual processes, and I think you can see it throughout my evidence statement in terms of COSLA and local government representatives being on the project group, being on the steering group. The political relationships are strong in Scotland. Some of that scale. There are only 32 local authorities and COSLA represents them all. The other thing that we have is regular liaison between the senior teams in Scottish Government and COSLA. So again, I'm not saying there are not times when there are disagreements between Scottish Government and COSLA, but the engagement that we enjoy from a COSLA perspective is good.
Are there no improvements to be made, though? I appreciate the structure may be in place. How do you ensure that's used at a time where things might be dynamic and fast-moving?
I think I would probably have to go away and have a think about that, given the way that COSLA is constituted. I don't know that you could put it into statute. We are a voluntary membership organisation, so I think it would be useful to go away and have a think about that. But the other thing it's worth mentioning, I think, is that despite the fact that we're not a statutory organisation, COSLA was regularly invited into the SCORE O and the SCORE M meetings, and as the inquiry has heard in other modules, the four harms approach was adopted in Scotland, and as part of that, one of those harms was economic harm. So there was also another opportunity to feed in information and intelligence there. Thank
you. Could I then finally ask you about the newly self-employed hardship fund? The inquiry understands that the Scottish Government identified that the UK-wide self-employment income support scheme did not cater to the newly self-employed. The Scottish Government, as we understand it, decided to provide a grant scheme that would cater to some people in this category, and the Scottish Government designed the scheme and the guidance for it with input from COSLA and local authorities. Is that correct? There was no such scheme developed or delivered by the United Kingdom government, and the inquiry is interested to explore your understanding of key elements of the Scottish scheme to aid a comparison of approaches and see what the decision-making ultimately came down to. To that end, I'd like to, as speedily as possible, go through the application form and the guidance document for that fund in Scotland. So if we begin with INQ 000655674, I presume you recognise this document?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. This is the application form for the fund. You can see that the go live date is the 30th of April 2020 at the top. And I'm just going to quote from the eligibility section here. The purpose of this fund is to provide hardship relief to newly self-employed individuals who have not been able to access support through other schemes or have exhausted all other avenues for business support. If we can zoom out from that then. Is it correct that the series of boxes that we see below are effectively a tick box exercise? Somebody self-certifies that they meet each of those criteria?
So the answer, yes or no?
Yes. And then there is a declaration at the bottom, and if we turn over the page, we can see the personal details that are required to be input: trading name, first and last name, address, phone number, email address, national insurance number, and bank account. And then an applicant is required to provide 4 pieces of supporting documentation, or rather 5. Proof of identity, proof of address, evidence of active trading up to March 2020, comprised of 3 forms of evidence, being bank statements and 2 of the other documents listed there. Is that right?
Yep.
And hopefully, more interestingly, can we now turn to the guidance note, which is INQ 000655673. If we look at the 4th bullet point, we can see that it says officers. So this is guidance issued to local authorities in how to deploy the scheme. Is that right?
Yes.
And it says officers should follow local guidance and best practice for financial management and counter fraud. If we move on to the bold text a bit further down the page, we can see that it says, in exceptional cases where applicants are unable to provide specific items of supporting evidence, action officers may accept alternatives in line with the guidance, but in doing so must be satisfied with the integrity of the application as a whole. This means that the combination of other supporting evidence supplied must provide a convincing picture of an applicant with a legitimate claim. This is fundamental to reducing fraud risk. This clearly relies on the judgment of local authority officers. Do you regard that as a strength or a weakness?
I regard that as a strength. Should probably declare an interest that I used to work in revenue and benefits, so calculating and issuing grants was something that I did. So the staff that were involved in assessing and using discretion in exceptional cases are incredibly well trained and experienced in how you would go about assessing the validity of a claim for something. I don't think that colleagues in Scottish Government or indeed COSLA would have been in a situation to come up with a set of guidance that would have applied in every scenario, but these teams that work in local authorities are used to assessing this type of claim in other times using all of that. The other thing that they would have access to would be all of the systems that are available. So they would have the non-domestic rates systems. They would have the ability to check other systems as well. So I don't think that the level of risk that was introduced here was disproportionate in terms of the grant that was being issued.
Thank you. And we can see further down the page, officers are not expected to verify all of these statements. This relates to the eligibility part, the yes or no, or undertake an assessment of hardship or independently check the applicant's status with regards to working age benefits. No supporting evidence is required specifically for this section of the form. And the example I want to put to you is this. Is it not possible that a genuine but mistaken applicant who is wrong about their trading profits would nonetheless be paid out under this scheme? And the reason I'm asking the question is to understand the appetite for the risk of fraud and error in a scheme such as this.
I think that's a possibility, but I don't think that was borne out by the work that was subsequently done by Audit Scotland. I think any time you're giving out public money, there's always a risk of fraud. But I don't feel that this was a particularly risky area. I think if it had been done in a way that it wasn't local teams that were assessing these, that might have introduced a bit more risk, but it certainly doesn't seem that the risk that was introduced here was disproportionate to me.
Thank you. Could we turn to page 3, please? It's the final question, Ms Dickey. It's the final bullet point under the mandatory any of the two following, please. This is further guidance on what other documentation could be. And it says this: other evidence of business activity to support your claim. This could include correspondence with a supplier or customer, testimonials, a photo of a vehicle bearing the applicant's details, so long as these match the details on the form. That doesn't seem to be a particularly robust counter-fraud mechanism, does it?
I think if you were basing your judgment on that bullet point alone, it wouldn't appear particularly robust. But I think you would be building a picture of the application as you were going. So I don't think you would provide a grant if that was the only thing you were able to substantiate, but you would be going elsewhere and looking for additional evidence, recognising that the speed at which these grants were being asked to be delivered.
Ms Dickey, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms Hudson. Thank you very much, Mr. I know you've already given a lot of help to the inquiry, but I think you, like Dr Llewellyn, may be helping us one more time. But thank you for the help that you've given us to date.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we need to take an early lunch today, Ms Hudson,
Yes,
so I
please.
shall return at 1:20.